It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones. The streets lay frozen under a thick blanket of snow, untouched, silent, as if the world itself had gone to sleep. The dim glow of a street lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the alleyway. Not a soul stirred, except for one. Masha, the Maine Coon, moved through the night like a ghost. Her thick, fluffy fur protected her, but she knew winter was unforgiving. She knew every inch of this town, every warm corner, every open window where a kind hand might leave scraps of food, but tonight felt different. Then she heard it, a faint, desperate cry. Masha froze, ears twitching. The sound was weak, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was there. A tiny, helpless whimper. Her sharp green eyes darted toward the source, a dark bundle, barely visible in the snow. She crept closer, her massive paws sinking into the ice. The cry grew weaker. Masha sniffed the air, sensing something fragile, something wrong. And then she saw him, a baby, alone, cold, barely moving. His tiny fingers peeked out from a flimsy, damp blanket. His face was pale, lips quivering, his little chest struggling to rise. He had been left here, abandoned. Masha's instincts kicked in. She had cared for kittens before, knew the warmth the tiny body needed. Without hesitation, she curled her massive, warm body around the baby, shielding him from the deadly cold. The wind howled through the alley, snowflakes swirling, but Masha did not move. She pressed closer, wrapping the baby in her thick fur, her own heartbeat steady, strong. Minutes passed. The baby's cries slowed. And then, footsteps. A shadow emerged from the distance, moving hesitantly toward the alley. An old woman, bundled in a heavy coat, peered down the narrow path. Beth Stanley. Her frail hands clutched her scarf. She had been feeding Masha for years, but tonight something pulled her outside. A whisper of urgency she couldn't ignore. Then, she saw it. Her heart stopped. Masha curled around something, and when Beth took a step closer, her breath caught in her throat. A baby, left to die in the cold but saved by a cat. Beth staggered back, her mind racing. Who would do this? Why? And more importantly, was the baby still alive? She lunged forward, panic rising as she reached out, but Masha did not move. She held firm, shielding the baby. Beth's fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone, her voice shaking. "Hello? There's a baby! Please send someone fast." The operator's voice crackled. "Stay where you are. Help is on the way." Beth's eyes filled with tears. She reached out again. This time, Masha allowed her. Beth gently touched the baby's tiny hand, still warm, still breathing. But for how much longer? The wind screamed through the alley as sirens blared in the distance. Beth whispered, "Hold on, little one. Just hold on." Beth Stanley's fingers trembled as she held the baby's tiny, fragile hand. His skin was ice cold. His breath shallow, too shallow. "No, no, no," Beth whispered, pressing the baby closer to her chest. She could feel the weight of his little body, but it was frighteningly still. His lips had turned a shade of blue that sent sheer panic through her veins. Masha, the Maine Coon, let out a deep, throaty purr, as if trying to keep him awake. She curled tighter, her thick fur brushing against the baby's cheek, her warmth pressing into his tiny body. But Beth knew, warmth alone wouldn't be enough. She glanced toward the road, searching for the flashing red and blue lights. The sirens were closer, but not close enough. Beth's heart pounded. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she pleaded, gently rubbing the baby's hands, his tiny fingers barely responding. "Don't you give up." But the baby wasn't moving. Think, Beth. Think. She had raised 3 kids of her own, had seen her share of medical emergencies, but never like this. Never a baby left to freeze in the dark. Her instincts took over. Beth unzipped her coat, yanked open her heavy sweater, and pressed the baby directly against her skin. His tiny body was so cold, it burned. She wrapped the edges of her coat around him, locking in as much warmth as possible. "Come on, honey, come on," she murmured. The baby let out the faintest whimper, a sound so weak, so fragile it made her eyes well up. Masha purred louder, nudging Beth's arm as if urging her to keep going. Beth rocked back and forth, rubbing the baby's back, willing warmth into him. He had to hold on. Just a few more minutes, just until help arrived. And then a scream pierced the night. Beth's head snapped up. A woman running. Sobbing. "My baby." Beth's breath caught. No, it couldn't be. The woman, mid-20s, hair wild, eyes wide with terror, sprinted toward them, slipping in the snow. She fell, scrambled back up, her hands outstretched. "Please, is he alive?" Beth instinctively tightened her hold. Was this the mother? Her mind raced. Why was she here now? Who leaves a baby in the freezing cold and then comes running back? The woman's face crumpled. I didn't mean to. I swear, I was scared. He wouldn't stop crying. I panicked. She was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. I thought someone would find him faster. I didn't know it would be this cold. Beth felt sick. This was the mother? The woman who left an infant to die in the snow? Masha let out a low, warning growl. Beth's mind was screaming with anger, with confusion, but she had no time to process it, because at that moment, the baby let out a tiny gasp. Beth's heart leapt. He's breathing. She choked out, but barely. The woman sobbed harder, collapsing to her knees. Please, I didn't mean to. I can't lose him. And then, the sirens arrived. Flashing lights flooded the alley, painting the snow in streaks of red and blue. Doors slammed, boots crunched, voices shouted, "Ma'am, step away from the baby." Beth looked up to see paramedics rushing toward her. But the mother? She staggered back, eyes darting wildly as 2 police officers closed in. And then she ran. The cops took off after her, shouting commands Beth barely registered, because all she could focus on was the small, fragile baby in her arms. The paramedics reached her. "We've got him! We've got him!" They moved fast, checking vitals, wrapping the baby in thermal blankets, rushing to the ambulance. Beth was left kneeling in the snow, Masha still pressed against her side, watching as they fought to save the tiny life that had been left behind. Would he survive? Or was it too late? Beth Stanley watched helplessly as the paramedics worked inside the ambulance. Through the fogged-up windows, she saw them moving fast, too fast. That wasn't good. They were fighting to keep the baby alive. Masha, the Maine Coon, sat beside her in the snow, her green eyes locked onto the flashing red and blue lights. She let out a deep, worried purr. Beth's breath trembled in the icy air. "Please, little one, hold on." The doors burst open as a paramedic shouted to the driver, "Go, now." The ambulance peeled away, tires skidding on the icy road. Beth's chest tightened. That was the kind of urgency that meant life or death. She took a shaky step forward, her hands still numb from holding the fragile baby. She wanted to go with them, to make sure he made it, to make sure he wasn't alone. But then, a struggle broke out behind her. The baby's mother, the young woman, the one who had abandoned the child, was thrashing in the snow as 2 officers wrestled her arms behind her back. "Please," she shrieked, her voice raw. "I didn't mean to leave him. I didn't know." "You left an infant in freezing temperatures," one officer snapped, locking the handcuffs. "He was dying." The woman sagged, sobbing, her breath ragged. Beth should have felt only anger, only disgust. But when she saw the way the woman's body shook, the way her eyes looked so haunted, something inside her twisted. Yes, she had abandoned her child. Yes, she had run. But why? Beth took a slow step forward. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. "My name is Emily, Emily Dixon." Beth's stomach dropped. Dixon, that was the baby's last name. Nicholas Dixon. This wasn't just a mother who abandoned a baby. This was his mother. Beth's voice was tight. "Why did you leave him?" Emily shook violently, her whole body racked with sobs. "Because I thought he'd be safer without me." The words hit Beth like a train. Safer without her? Beth glanced at the officer. He gave her a look, one that said, "We'll deal with this," but Beth needed to hear it. Needed to understand. Emily sniffed hard, trying to speak between ragged breaths. I had nowhere to go. No food, no money. I tried everything. I begged, but no one helped. And then I saw the weather report." Her voice broke. "I thought if I left him where someone could find him, he'd have a chance." Beth's pulse pounded. Emily wasn't lying. Beth had seen desperation before. But this was beyond it. The officer shook his head. "Leaving an infant in the cold is attempted murder. We'll get social services involved, but she's coming with us." Beth's mind spun. She had always been a woman who saw things in black and white, right and wrong. But now, she saw a gray so deep, so complicated, she didn't know how to feel. The second police car pulled away, taking Emily Dixon with it. Beth's breath was shaky. She looked down at Masha, who was staring at her, almost knowingly. And that's when Beth knew what she had to do. She turned toward her car, threw open the door, and climbed inside. She was going to the hospital. Because right now, nothing else mattered, except one thing. Was baby Nicholas still alive? Beth's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she weaved through the near-empty streets. She had to get there. Had to see if Nicholas was... No, she wouldn't let herself finish that thought. He had to make it. Masha, the Maine Coon, sat in the passenger seat, her thick tail curled around her paws. She was unnervingly calm, as if she knew where they were going, as if she knew why. Beth barely noticed the tension in her own chest until she gasped for air at a red light. Her breath fogged the windshield. What if I'm too late? The light changed. Beth slammed the gas. Minutes later, she screeched into the hospital parking lot, throwing the car into park before she even processed the movement. The engine hummed, headlights cutting through the dark. Beth bolted. The hospital doors slid open and warm air rushed over her. But it didn't matter. She rushed to the front desk. "The baby," she gasped. "The baby they just brought in, Nicholas Dixon. Where is he?" The receptionist barely had time to blink before Beth pressed on. "He was found outside, freezing. I was the one who," a firm voice cut through. "Ma'am?" Beth turned, breath catching in her throat. A doctor stood there, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. Time slowed. Beth barely got the words out. "Is he?" The doctor exhaled. "He's alive." Beth's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the counter for support, eyes blurring with tears. Alive. Masha, still somehow beside her, let out a soft, satisfied purr. Beth swallowed hard. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated. "He's in the NICU. We've stabilized his temperature, but he's weak. We're monitoring his oxygen levels and heart rate closely." Beth nodded rapidly. "Please, I need to see him." Something in her voice must have reached the doctor, because after a pause he sighed. "Follow me." Her feet moved before her brain even caught up, through sterile hallways, past hushed voices. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose, but Beth only had eyes for what was ahead. And then, the NICU doors swung open. Beth's breath caught. There, in a tiny hospital bassinet, wrapped in layers of warm blankets connected to delicate monitors, was Nicholas. So small, so fragile, but his chest was ringing and falling. Beth pressed a hand to her heart. He was fighting. A nurse looked up. "Are you family?" Beth opened her mouth, paused. Was she? She wasn't his mother. She wasn't related by blood, and yet, in that moment, she felt something stronger than words could describe. She stepped closer, voice softer than it had ever been. I'm the reason he's here." The nurse studied her for a moment, then, as if understanding something unspoken, she nodded. Beth carefully reached out, brushing a single fingertip against the tiny hand peeking from the blanket. And in that moment, Nicholas's tiny fingers curled around hers. A sharp gasp escaped Beth's lips, tears spilled over. Masha let out a low, approving purr. Beth gripped his hand tighter. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she whispered. "Not anymore." But what would happen next? Would Nicholas go into foster care? Would Emily get him back? And where did Beth fit into all of this? She didn't know. But she did know one thing. She wasn't leaving him. Beth's breath shook as she held on to the baby's delicate hand. She had no right to be here, and yet she couldn't pull away. Masha, the Maine Coon, perched on the chair nearby, her tail flicking rhythmically, as if waiting for something, or someone. A nurse approached quietly. "He's a fighter," she murmured, adjusting the monitors. "Most babies wouldn't have survived that cold. But this little guy? He's got a strong heart." Beth swallowed hard. A strong heart. Nicholas stirred slightly, his tiny mouth opening in a silent yawn. The sight punched Beth in the chest. This wasn't just a baby. This was a life that almost didn't get the chance to be lived. A throat cleared behind her. Beth turned, and her stomach dropped. Emily Dixon. The baby's mother stood at the doorway, escorted by a social worker. Her wrists were no longer cuffed, but her eyes, they were haunted. Beth stiffened instinctively. She doesn't deserve to be here. But then, Emily's gaze dropped to Nicholas, and the second she saw her baby, her entire body crumpled. A broken sob tore from her throat. "I never wanted to leave him," she whispered. Beth's heart pounded. "I was starving," Emily continued, her voice raw, "sleeping in my car, no money, no help. I thought if I left him somewhere safe, he'd have a better chance without me." Beth should have felt rage, should have felt nothing but judgment. But what she felt was understanding. She'd spent her whole life believing in right and wrong. But now, she saw a desperate mother. A woman who had nothing. A woman who thought she was doing the only thing she could. And Beth couldn't ignore it. The social worker stepped forward. "Emily is cooperating fully. The courts will decide what happens next." Beth looked down at Nicholas. His tiny fingers twitched in sleep. This baby, this little miracle, deserved more than just a legal battle. Beth inhaled sharply and turned to Emily. I won't let him go into the system, she said firmly. Emily flinched, eyes brimming with fresh tears. Please, please don't let them take him. Beth studied her for a long moment. Then, a decision settled deep in her soul. What if I help you? Emily's breath hitched. What? Beth's voice was steady now. What if we do this together? You need help, and Nicholas needs a mother who won't give up on him. Emily's lip quivered. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She choked back a sob. I don't deserve that. Beth exhaled. Maybe, maybe not, but Nicholas deserves a chance. Emily looked at her baby, really looked at him, and in that moment something in her shifted. She nodded, a tiny fragile nod. The social worker watched, hesitant. It won't be easy. The courts. We'll figure it out, Beth cut in, because deep down, she knew. This wasn't just about saving a baby anymore. This was about saving a family. And maybe, just maybe, this was the reason fate had brought them all together. Masha let out a deep, contented purr. Beth smiled, reaching down to stroke the cat's thick fur. She had found purpose again. She had found family again. And in the quiet hum of the hospital room, as Nicholas let out a tiny sigh in his sleep, Beth knew this was only the beginning.